about divorcing her.
My kids are out of control.
I'm not hurting anyone with my choices.
I thought they were my friends.
Should I quit my job?
I'm just gonna wing it.
I don't want to work anymore.
Follow your passion.
Believe you can do it and you will.
Everything happens for a reason.
Fake it till you make it.
Be yourself.
Take risk.
Never give up.
I can't feel my fingers anymore. Lloyd, they're numb.
Ooh. Maybe you should wear these extra gloves. My hands are starting to get sweaty.
Extra gloves? You've had this pair of extra gloves this whole time?
Yeah, we're in the Rockies.
I'm going to kill you.
What?
I'm gonna kill you! I'm gonna kill you, Lloyd!
Calm down!
Right now, I'm gonna kill you!
Harry, you got that crazy look in your eye!
I know what I'm gonna do.
What are you doing?
I'm gonna do something I should have done a long time ago.
Ah! Don't do anything foolish, Harry!
What? Foolish? This isn't foolish.
You're gonna do it! No! Harry!
Harry! Your hands are freezing! Harry!
Okay, here's the plan. We borrow a few bucks, just a small loan from the briefcase, and we find ourselves some reasonable lodgings. Good plan. And we'll keep track of all the money we spend with IOUs. We'll be meticulous, right down to the last penny. Whatever we borrow, we pay back. Absolutely. We're good for it. Well, where is our bond?
This is the Hotel Danbury Presidential Suite, gentlemen. Normally reserved for royalty, visiting dignitaries, illustrious stars of stage and screen. We have shortly coming the Emperor and Empress of Japan. And of course, Princess Charles and I, when they were together, used to frequent the hotel constantly.
So when going to the Rockies, plan accordingly, and if you didn't, make sure and ask your friend if they did. You know, whether it's for an overnight stay or an extended vacation, planning is crucial, as we saw in the opening clip with the two guys from Dumb and Dumber. You got to know where you're going. And once you know where you're going, you need to plan according to that. The lack of planning often leads to people having a toothbrush but no toothpaste, or toothpaste but no toothbrush, right? When we go on trips. And while this lack of planning can easily be resolved with strong, minty, chewing gum on your trip, a lack of planning can actually present more challenges. It's a lot more difficult in accomplishing where you're heading to. It's like planning a trip and having your car break down because of lack of maintenance. That required planning. You should have planned ahead because you knew that you were going to be taking a long trip. Or it would be like planning a trip and underestimating the cost of the trip, and then you run out of money. You have to plan ahead. For the last year and a half, our family has actually been wanting to take this road trip that we're actually hoping to make this year. And I enjoy planning. I love trying to figure out problems. Math is something that I really enjoy. So this week I started to plan as to how much of this trip would cost if we actually took it. I did a quick figure of what gas would be, and I estimated that just running some quick numbers, crunching some numbers, it would be about $700 round trip, for this trip to where we were wanting to go. After we were looking at a time frame, I decided to do a little bit more checking and go more thorough on this plan. So what I did is I went on Gas Buddy and I actually checked what the prices were on each gas station that we would stop in. I had to try to figure out the cities, how much mileage we would get. And once I started to look at the gas prices and trying to figure out all the cities, I realized that my number wasn't only off, the number that I originally thought was really generous of $700 was actually non-realistic. a more realistic and accurate, non-generous number, right? This is just simply what it's going to cost. You're not allowing any room for give. It would actually be $810. So $110 over my generous idea of what it was going to cost to take this road trip. Turns out that when you average at $3, it doesn't work out when you have cities that have gas at over $5 a gallon. You have to try to figure out where you're going. You have to plan accordingly. Now, this is just one factor of the trip that was going to be off. Planning is crucial because we often think about these things and we're like, well, it doesn't really matter. No, it does. Down the road, it's going to matter. And it's so crucial that in Luke chapter 14, verse 28 through 32, Jesus talks about the importance of planning before you start on anything. He says this, don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction on a building without first calculating to see if there is enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, there's a person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he will send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. Jesus is using examples of areas where we're supposed to exercise wisdom. We're supposed to think about these things. Before you start something that in the long run will only cause you harm or make us look like fools. Why would you start on something that you can't finish? Why don't you plan before you actually set yourself out on that trip? Don't start something without figuring out if you can finish it, and don't take on a mission that you will only find yourself defeated at later. Be careful what you're taking on. Plan ahead. And most people find themselves living in the moment foolishly. We don't really plan ahead. We're not really thinking ahead. We're just thinking about the moment. Or if not, we're plunging into the future recklessly without planning for anything. We're just right here, right now, this is what I'm doing. At times, trying to make this clear distinction because there's this difficulty that comes with it. Because people will see, well, if I don't plan for it, I'm living by faith, right? Isn't that what we're doing? And trying to make that clear distinction between planning wisely and moving forward by faith is sometimes really hard to identify. It's really difficult to try to figure out, am I living by faith or am I living foolishly? This was actually a topic that Milo, who was part of our governing board, asked, and it's a great topic that we're going to be coming back to in the weeks ahead, the difference between foolishness and faith. But the truth is that the majority of the time, people aren't living by faith. They're simply plunging into the future with confidence, but no wisdom. Now, if you look at Hebrews 11:1, it actually talks about what faith is, and it talks about there being confidence in the things we can't see. So some would say, well, but that's confidence. This is what Proverbs chapter 14, verse 16 says. The wise are cautious and avoid danger. Fools plunge ahead with reckless confidence. There's wisdom in looking ahead and trying to avoid the things that are going to cause issues later. Foolish people, just move forward without even considering what it's going to cost. So understand that confidence in and of itself is not faith, it's foolish. You could be confident and you could give other people confidence, but it's foolish if you are not living according to a plan or a design. Again, we're going to come back to that topic in the weeks ahead, but the difference between faith and foolishness. But understand that the key part of that verse is that wise people are cautious, they avoid danger, and they're moving forward. But the difference is it's not careless confidence. It's not simply saying, I'm confident in what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing. It's not careless. There's a reason for that confidence. And it is because they consider and they take into account the risks and the dangers before moving ahead. Within some churches, one of the things that happens when it comes to planning, so if we were to separate both planning and faith, even though we're not going into the topic today, Some churches portray planning in a negative way because it means that if you're planning, you're not living by faith. And while there's some truth to that it could prevent us from living in faith, and I'm going to address that in just a second, here lies the wisdom and the issue. A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. That's a wisdom. Here is the issue. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. They're both moving forward. It's just the way that you're moving forward. One is evaluating, the other one is just simply moving. It is prudent, it is wise to foresee, to look ahead into the future and plan ahead by taking precautions. So when a church says, well, you're not living by faith, you also can't live foolishly. You have to try to differentiate what that is. Because simpletons dive in head first, blindly, and then they suffer the consequences in the aftermath of their foolishness. In life and as believers, we have to understand, and this is something that the church does a terrible job at conveying, faith doesn't always lead us blindly. Sometimes there's markers in faith that is a way that we should go. So now here lies the issue on the opposite end of the spectrum. Within some churches, they fail to operate in faith and simply operate by planning. It's only what we're kind of seeing. Hey, you have to give me some measurements of what's going to take place because that's what we're planning for. We're planning for success. This is how we're going to accomplish A, B, C. But at the same time, there's really no faith. There's just a lot of organization. There's a lot of business mindset, but there's no faith involved. And the truth is that here is wisdom, and here's the wisdom and the foolishness of both. That both ultimately have merit, but both can also lead you to foolishness. There's wisdom and there's foolishness. And sometimes dividing both is really tricky. And we're going to concentrate for today on the planning side of it. So I want to, oh my goodness, this thing is being ridiculous. Okay. But one of the things that we see is that there is a great example of foolish planning. And it is found in Jesus' parable of the rich fool who lays out his retirement plan only to learn that he wouldn't even get to enjoy his retirement plan because his life was going to expire that very night. And oftentimes we see that we are planning and it's foolish. We think we're going to get to enjoy it later. We're going to get to do this. We're going to get to do that. And there's no wisdom in that. So how do you navigate both, right? How do you navigate the difference between wisdom in planning and foolishness in planning? This guy, let's just say the rich person, because if we were to just identify him, he's rich, he's planning for the future, and yet he's defined as a fool. What's the difference in planning foolishly and planning wisely? So as stating, we're going to be coming back in the weeks ahead for the difference in faith and foolishness, but here is the foolishness that we have in planning, and we're simply going to keep it to 3 things that contribute to foolish planning. So the first one, in how we plan foolishly, we've already kind of alluded to this, but it is that we plan with no plan to die. Now, I know that it sounds morbid. I get it. It sounds like really dark and eerie. But there's nothing wrong with planning for the future. There's nothing wrong with planning for retirement. If you look at that rich fool, he was planning for, hey, I'm going to look ahead and I'm going to take this time and I'm going to build and ultimately I'm going to get to this point in the future where I'm going to just be able to rest. The issue is that people will often find themselves like the rich fool who is living for the future without treasuring and valuing today. We're simply looking to the future. We're not thinking about today. We're not considering the things that are taking place today. And when we look at each day as a sacrifice that we have to make that will ultimately give us purpose and fulfillment in the future, we fail to live up to our purpose for today while trying to accumulate enough for a season of life that we don't even know if we're going to reach. Let me repeat that. When we are living for the future only, when we're planning for the future, we look at each day as a sacrifice that we must make that will ultimately give us purpose and fulfillment in the future, and we fail to live up to our purpose for today while trying to accumulate enough for a season of life that we don't even know if we're going to reach. Does that make sense? Let me put it a different way. We are planning for retirement, and in the moment, all that you're thinking is, there's going to be a season in life where I'm going to get to enjoy all this. What you're sacrificing is your marriage, what you're sacrificing is your kids, what you're sacrificing is your relationships, and you're continuing to move towards that end goal, not realizing that you're compromising everything along the way. Not only that, we build our lives for that moment, and we're losing purpose every day because we're just focusing on the day that we can retire and just sit by the beach and enjoy life without even knowing if you're going to get there. It's foolish. We plan life with no plan to die. We're not even considering that reality. Unfortunately, this is our reality, as morbid as it sounds. King Solomon puts it this way. He says, there are people who are wealthy, and then he says they die and someone else, even a stranger, ends up enjoying their wealth. And he says this is meaningless, a sickening tragedy. So think about that. A person who can be wealthy, or even if you're not, but you just have enough money, you're going to work your entire life, and ultimately there is going to come a point where you're going to die. That's just a reality. And everything that you accumulated will be left for somebody else to enjoy. Doesn't that feel meaningless? Everything that you work to acquire, somebody else gets to enjoy. And everything you worked for and planned for stays behind because it's only a season in life. Something that we plan for without accounting our unappointed expiration date. We don't even think about that. We're like, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to set my heart to do. Now, once again, differentiate. The main problem with planning for the future, like the rich fool that Jesus refers to, is that life becomes about accumulating without contemplating. There's no purpose. All that your purpose is in the future. It's not in the here and now. You're not thinking about the reality of death. You're not thinking about the things that you're supposed to be doing, the things that matter, that you're supposed to involve yourself into. Which is why Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4 is one of my favorite passages. And it says this, I often quote this: better to spend your time at funerals than at parties. After all, everyone dies. That's just a reality. So the living should take this to heart. Now, this is really difficult for us to understand. Why would it be better to be at a funeral than at a party? Sorrow is better than laughter, for sadness has a refining influence on us. A wise person thinks a lot about death, while a fool thinks only about having a good time, right? It's easier that way. If I could just have a good time, life gives meaning, it's great. Until all of a sudden, and we see this reality not only in our lives as adults, but even as teenagers. We've had a few instances where a teenager passes away at a young age, and at that moment, it causes even teenagers to contemplate, man, that could have been me. And it changes our view, because all of a sudden there's more to life. Because I don't know when I'm going to die. What's the purpose for it? And the issue is, with the rich fool, is that he's planning for everything except the reality that awaits all of us. It's death. Right? It's so foolish. We all know that we're going to die. There's only one way out of this world. We all know that we have no idea when that's going to happen. Whether you're going to be old and fragile in a bed and die peacefully, or it's going to be a difficult season of life where you may experience something terminal. You just don't know. And for this rich fool that's planning ahead for his retirement, he looks forward to being able to sit back and enjoy having a good time without taking into account the reality that he's going to die that very night. And everything that he worked for will be left for someone else to enjoy. Rather than letting the reality of death shape his purpose, his decisions, and his plans, which ultimately determines how he lives. Are you understanding how we live foolishly in our planning? We rarely, if ever, live in light of death and eternity because we live for the here and the now. Or if not, our plans are shaped by the future. We don't know we will even get to live. We accumulate everything that we can't take out of it. And this leads to the next issue. And that is that we plan, at times we plan wisely, but we deviate from it. We start off strong, but then all of a sudden we find ourselves going astray. And once again, it's wisdom, but then somewhere around the middle, things just kind of catch our attention. I shared this story before, but it's been almost 10 years since I was working at a church in North Dakota. And at that time, we were working with teens, and we had planned to go to this music festival. It was called Hills Alive. It was in Rapid City, South Dakota. Now, my family and I had never been to Rapid City, South Dakota, and my family was actually planning on coming up that summer as well, and they wanted to visit Mount Rushmore. So we decided, hey, before the music festival comes, before my family comes, our family should make this trip so that we kind of get familiar with the area, and we know maybe some of the things that are there to enjoy. So we decided to make this trip. I turned on maps. So we're living in North Dakota. We're heading to South Dakota. Pretty simple, right? I mean, you just have to head south. And I turned on maps, and as we started to head there, we got close enough to Rapid City that you begin to see signs and mile markers telling you where South Dakota is because you're getting close. Now, you're in the middle of nowhere, so I figured, how difficult can it be to actually get to Rapid City? So I turned off the phone, and it was a big mistake. After feeling like we should have been there already, we come upon this giant sign on the right side of the road that says, "Welcome to Wyoming." And it was that lesson learned. It was like, oh my goodness, I was so dumb, But you never turn your GPS before you get to your location. Never. However, I'm not the wisest person. Fast forward, and we take our third trip that summer, which was now with the teens. We're going to be going to this music festival, and we were excited about it. We've been there a couple of times. The festival got done, so now we're actually on our way back. We gave parents an ETA as to around the time that we're going to be getting to Dickinson, North Dakota. And we get to this road, and I had the GPS on my phone, and I think, you know what? We've been here enough. I know where we're going. Turn it off. So Gina turns it off. And at that point, I feel confident. Now, I knew that there was one more turn that I had to make. I knew there was one more turn. And, it wasn't just a straight shot. We had to take one more turn, and then it was going to be straight. But that turn felt like it just wasn't coming, It's like it should have already been here. If I would have just looked at the compass on the vehicle, I would have seen an E that would have indicated that I was heading not north. We were actually heading back to Minnesota, and we're supposed to be heading to Dickinson, North Dakota. Once again, oftentimes, this is how we find ourselves making foolish planning. We start on the right path, so we say, hey, you know what? The reason that I'm planning for the future is for this. And we start on the right path only to turn off that sense of direction, which is God's direction of, hey, you know what this life is about. And somehow along this path, we find ourselves deviating from that plan that we're intended to go on until we find ourselves lost. We don't have purpose. We're investing our lives into everything that we will lose one day, but that's what we built our life on. We're deviating from that wise path that we started on. This another great example in the Bible of how this can happen, where you're on the right track and then you go off track, is found in the story of a talking donkey. And I'm not talking about the Shrek one, this is a different one. Numbers chapter 22, we learn of a guy by the name of Balaam. And Balaam was a non-Israelite prophet and diviner, which a diviner is defined as someone that practices the art for telling the future. in future events or discovering hidden knowledge by the aid of supernatural powers. So ultimately, he's this mediator in a sense. Now, the Moabite king, Balak, wanted to conquer the people of Israel. But similar to the story or the parable that Jesus uses, he also knows, I can't conquer Israel. There's no possible way that I could actually beat Israel. So what the Moabite king does is he actually sends some messengers for Balaam, who is the diviner, the non-Israelite prophet. And the reason that he's sending for him is because he wants for him to curse the Israelites so that he could conquer them. Now, this is what Numbers chapter 22, verse 12 states. But God told Balaam, do not go with them. You are not to curse these people, for they have been blessed. There's a direction, right? Don't do it. Just simply don't do it. Balaam refuses to go after hearing this. The interesting part is that in verse 20 of that same chapter, it says that night God came to Balaam and told him, since these men have come for you, get up and go with them, but do only what I tell you to. So now he's getting this, go ahead, do it. And this is where things get really interesting. The next morning, Balaam saddles up his donkey to go with these men, and through a series of events, he ends up beating his donkey after he keeps refusing to stay on the path. Now, this is where the story goes dark, like X-Files dark, and the donkey that starts talking, and he asks Balaam, hey, why are you beating me? This is the interesting part. Unfazed by the talking donkey, at least from what the passage tells us, Balaam starts arguing with the donkey. He starts to tell him, this is the reason that I'm beating you. And that is until this happens. This is verse 31. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the roadway with a drawn sword in his hand. Balaam bowed his head and fell face down on the ground before him. Why did you beat your donkey those 3 times? The angel of the Lord demanded. Look, I have come to block your way because you are stubbornly resisting me. You know, as you read this story at face value, not only is it unique, but it comes across as confusing. It's really confusing, actually. Because it appears that Balaam listened to God. He just went because God told him, okay, get up with these men and go. The issue is that we often read the Bible without understanding the issue of the human heart. 2 Peter mentions people who follow in the footsteps of Balaam, and here is a reason his donkey was being prevented to go forward by the angel of the Lord. And it is because, and this is what 2 Peter mentions, he loved to earn money by doing wrong. So now we understand, hey, there's an issue with Balaam. There's greed. It's similar to, hey, there's a rich fool, there's money. It's not the issue of planning, it's the issue of the heart. What happens is Balaam begins to deviate from the plan when it becomes about money. Numbers chapter 31 tells us, actually, verse 16, Numbers 31:16 states, Balaam gave advice to the Moabite king that caused the people of Israel to rebel against the Lord at Mount Peor. Okay, now here's the issue with Balaam. Balaam loved money by doing wrong. The Lord tells him, don't go. Then in this sense, he tells him, go. Then this donkey stands on the way or doesn't go forward. And what happens is he's told, hey, you're resisting God. There's the issue. Why? Because he wants to go. He wants the money. When he goes forward and he realizes, I can't curse these people because God has blessed them, what does he do? He devises a plan to go around that. Since he couldn't curse them, he advises the king, hey, teach them how to rebel against God, and then they will be cursed. So let me tie all this together to give one example of how we do this. Once again, we plan wisely. I believe that for the most part, when we're looking at things, we're thinking, okay, when we're followers of Jesus, we think, hey, I want to honor God in this, and we plan for the future, understanding, hey, we're mortal beings, and we're trying to make wise decisions, and God is at the center of all of it. But then we find ourselves deviating from that plan and finding ourselves compromising, similar to Balaam, and foolishly making decisions that have become our goal, our focus, and our idol. For Balaam, it's money. And when you're planning for the future, it all becomes about money, and it begins to dictate, and it's almost like this virus that just starts to infect every part of our lives, or we're sacrificing everything. We're sacrificing our faith, we're sacrificing our family, we're sacrificing our kids, we're sacrificing our friends. It's all about what we want. And understand that not every idea or goal is established with bad motives. But to what extent does the result of our future affect our decisions today? Because it starts somewhere, right? If I were to say, I want to take a trip, you start trying to figure out, how am I going to acquire that money? Am I going to save? Am I going to sell something? You're already planning. There's a reason that premeditated murder has a greater consequence than just the murder in the heat of the moment. You're planning for it. And every decision that you're making is planning for that moment. Nothing wrong with planning for the future, but understand, set your path and don't deviate from it. Don't deviate from it to acquire something tomorrow that will compromise today. So here's the word of wisdom. Commit your actions to the Lord and your plans will succeed, right? There's the key. You have to commit yourself to God. Everything that you're doing, hey, this is Mark chapter 12, verse 30. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Hey, how can I do that? How can I love God and love people in a way that ultimately the future doesn't affect how I'm going to accomplish that today? Because it's not about greed, it's about how God will be honored. And at times our plans fail, not for lack of effort or desire, but because our motives are all wrong. We're willing to trample over anyone and everyone just to get what we want. And here's the thing, at times your plans succeed, but when they're apart from God, here's what happens. I've shared this at youth group, but more than likely not everybody in this room will know us. He's kind of outdated now, but Marcus Persson, he was a creator of Minecraft. He sold his company, acquired all this money, and he realized, I have all this money, and I have people, but at the same time, I still feel empty. You can get to the point where you succeed in your future, but here's the issue. You'll get there and you'll find that there is no lasting value, but simply temporary satisfaction. And you're constantly having to go to that well to get water. So the last thing when planning is this, and this is pretty significant, and the reason why is because this is the way that we foolishly attribute either failure or success. So when plans fail, what happens is we have to be wise enough to separate what is the work of the devil and what is the work or restraint of God. When we plan for the future, sometimes when things don't pan out, the first reaction, the knee-jerk reaction from the church is, oh, the devil's working, right? And actually, in the account of Balaam, we actually see these two things in action. We actually see how the devil is establishing the motives of Balaam, but then we see the restraint of God as he stood in front of the donkey to prevent him from carrying out that plan. But he did it anyways. Now, it doesn't mean that God has limited restraint, but at the same time, we have free will. That's what caused the issue to begin with. So when people say, well, God could have prevented it, for sure. But now if God steps into our world and prevents us from doing something, then all of a sudden we say, well, that's not fair because he didn't allow me to carry out my free will. While God at times does prevent that, understand that at times God will allow it as well. So as stated in the beginning of the service, there's many ways that we can plan. With money, for retirement, but they aren't the only things that require planning or define our motive. I know that I focused a lot on that aspect of money, and the reason why is because Jesus talks about it. But the Bible also talks about people who plot or plan evil, And at the same time, it equally gives us examples of individuals who plan to do good. And in the midst of this, we actually see the devil at work and God at work. And when our plans don't pan out, once again, typically within the church, we actually see people say, well, the devil either made me do it or prevented me from doing it. And we see this example of both aspects of God and the devil's work in the life of Balaam, but we also see it in the life of the disciples. Now, the interesting part about these two verses that I'm going to share is that the disciples' goal was actually to spread the gospel. It's a good goal, right? They want to share the message. They want for others to hear this message of repentance, that their lives can be transformed so that they're living full lives. And interestingly enough, Paul's plans don't go according to plan. In the first letter to the church in Thessalonica, Paul writes to them and says this: "We wanted very much to come and see you," right? There's that plan. "And I, Paul, tried again and again," he's trying to make it succeed, "but Satan prevented us." So now we're seeing, okay, there's a plan that didn't pan out for Paul, and it was actually the work of the devil. There will be times in life that no matter how hard you try, and it could be a good motive, it could be a beneficial motive, your plans are not going to come to fruition. They're not going to happen. And while the devil is limited in his ability, one of the things that we have to understand is that he is also waging a war that allows him to inflict some things in our lives. And Paul's referring to that. Hey, Satan has prevented me from doing this. It's a good thing. Satan has prevented me. And once again, growing up within the church, I have very overly religious, spiritual family members who, once again, it doesn't matter what it is. Hey, the reason that that's not working, it's good. God wants me to do it. And I think the reason it's not working is because ultimately the devil's preventing me from doing it. The devil's in the details. And that is true. It could very well be that the devil's in the details. But keep in mind the other side of it, that at times that same difficulty that we're having in accomplishing those plans may actually be God working as well and restraining us from doing things that maybe aren't beneficial at the moment. Another great example of plans not panning out for Paul is found in Romans chapter 1, verse 13, where he writes, "I want you to know," reading to the church in Rome, "dear brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to visit you, but I was prevented until now." So there's a plan, there's a prevention. "I want to work among you and see spiritual fruit, just as I have seen among other Gentiles." So we're seeing, hey, Paul's plan didn't pan out all the time. Now, they were probably beneficial because he was encouraging him and wanting to see that spiritual fruit come to light. But at times, here's the issue when planning. We see our plans failing, and the default is, well, the devil's, just preventing us from doing it. That's what it is. But again, it's equally as important to remember that at times it's God's restraint, either maybe because it's not for our benefit, or maybe it's just for a season to grow us. So we have to be able to take those three things into account. If your plans aren't working, don't simply go to the church answer of, well, the devil's in the details. But at the same time, hey, you know what? Maybe it's just not God's will, and you're sinning. At the same time, maybe it is God's will, but it's just not for right now. And it's difficult in trying to sort out through these things. But I want to close up with two verses, and it's verses of encouragement that are difficult for us to apply, but nonetheless, it helps us to understand that, hey, you know what? Life is going to get difficult. You're not going to figure everything out, but we can rest knowing that we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. You can plan whatever you want, but ultimately, God is in the details. Whether God permits for the devil to restrain us from doing what he's calling us to do, or whether it's God saying, not this season, or maybe, hey, you're off track. Get back on track. And this is equally as important, and this is the final verse. You can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose will prevail. So, hey, you could make whatever plans you want, but at the end of the day, the it's ultimately God's will that's going to have his way. And I've used this example many times as well, and I'll close up with this. My goals, my plans, my dreams when I was younger was, have a music career, and it was ultimately to get married at the age of 30, simply have 1 or 2 kids, and here I am getting married at the age of 20. 20, I don't know, I'm looking at my wife for answers. Getting married at the age of 20-ish, and having 6 kids, a family of 8. And life has taken turns and swerves, and it's not exactly what I thought it would be. And my plan didn't succeed, but God's plan did, and I'm grateful for it, because it has made me a better man. Am I perfect? Far from it. But nonetheless, God ordains our steps. Just rest in that. Let's pray.